All right, hello. So this is sort of a quick impromptu video that I'm trying to record to help demonstrate how to read and process files in Python. So the idea is we're going to basically go through what code we can use in order to read the contents of a file into your Python script and then be able to access and work with that particular information. So the setup that we've got so far. So in my repository area here, sort of in my working folder, I've got my Jupyter Notebook, IPYNB demo file. I also have a myfile.txt file and a letters.csv file. So these are all inside the same folder, which means that that when I'm referring to one of these files, the path I'm using to get to them is going to be look inside that file in this exact same folder. All right, so let's talk about how we actually open a file. So when we're doing opening files, and I'm working a little bit off memory here, so forgive me if it takes me a second. The keyword that we need to make sure we're using when we're opening files is we're going to use the with keyword. Basically, it says that we're going to open up a file, but we want to make sure that we are handling any kind of errors that might occur. These are not errors that you're going to introduce, but these are errors that might happen if someone like deletes the file in the middle of us reading or working with it or some other kind of thing. So basically, just good styles that we're going to end up using the with keyword to create a block of code that will read and process our file. Once we have that, we're going to want to open the file. So we're going to do that using the open function. And this is going to take in as an argument the path to that file. So again, remember that the name of the file, what I'm working with, is myfile.txt. And because that file is in the current folder, I don't need to put anything else. I don't want to put a slash in front of it because that would say go to my root directory. I could, if that myfile.txt was in like a data folder, then I might do something like open up the data folder's myfile.txt, but it's in the exact same folder because I'm just sort of doing this quickly. So we want to say that we're opening up myfile.txt. The last piece we need to do that is we basically need to say, let's give a name to that file that we're opening up. And this is basically literally assigning that file name to a variable. So we're going to say open the myfile.txt, and then we're going to use this as keyword to indicate what the name of the variable should be that represents that file. Traditionally, this often gets called something like f. You could call it file. I'm a big fan of file because it tells me exactly what it is. So this is going to be, for example, as the this is the text file, for example. Let's call it as the text file. Followed by a colon as normal, followed by indenting because we're then adding in we're adding in a block to say here's a bunch of code we want to run with that file open. So it's basically saying like with a open file that we're referring to as text file, let's do some work to see what's happening. If we want to see what this looks like, we could, for example, try printing out text file and just look to see sort of what we got a little bit. Text file, singular. I'm going to execute this code, and I spelled things wrong. That's fine. I'm going to execute the code, and you see that what it prints out this IO text IO wrapper. IO is short for input output. It's a computer sort of like speak for communicating things. But basically says that we are opening up a file for us to work with. So that file itself doesn't, like that variable text file doesn't have any information that we can use in it directly. However, we can start calling methods on it in order to actually read the data out of that file to then work with. So there's three ways that we can read the contents out of a file. What's the right order, right? So the first one we can do is if I want to read so if we let's take a look at this file for a second. So if we open up myfile.txt, it's a text file. It has 3 lines of text in it. Hello world, it's a very fine morning, and Python, because I ran out of things to say. So once I have this file open, there's a couple of different methods and functions I can use on this file in order to be able to access its data. So the first, and in some ways the most useful thing we might do, is if I take my text file, I can call a function on it called readLine. And what this function is going to do is it's going to read a single line from that file. So it's going to basically say, open up the file and like look at the first line of code on it, and then it will read that line, take that text as a string, and then return that value for me to use later. So I might be able to say that I want the first line of my file is going to be the text file dot read line, or to read that individual line. And then, for example, if I print out then what the first line might be, when I re-execute this code, you'll notice that it then reads out the text file dot read line. It reads out that line, right, that first line, and then lets me print it out. Do you see how there's an extra space here, though? What happens is that when it reads that first line, what it's reading is it's reading these letters, HELLO space WORLD exclamation point, but it also then reads this piece as well. It reads that line break. It says that here is effectively the line that's going to get me to the next thing that I want to do. What is that last? It's what's called a new line character. Basically, it's the enter, the return, the carriage return that says let me go to the next thing. So like if I might be able to access it. If I try printing out, for example, the last character of first line, you'll see that what it prints out is this blank space. If I ask if that thing is in fact the new line character, then it tells us that yes, that we've printed out that thing, that element is effectively what we printed out at the end was this new line element. Really fun way of doing this actually is if we print out converting first line into a list, and this is just trying to show off what's going on here. Then you can see that the letters that it read was HELLO space WORLD exclamation point new line character, right? So that's the last letter that gets read. So it's worth noting that when you read off a line of text, you're going to get this line break block at the end. So often when you're printing or doing some processing, you'll have to then deal with that as well. All right, so this is the first way of reading files, and this is going to be one line at a time. Once we've read the first line, I can then call readLine again to read the next line as well. So for example, if I want to say that's the first line, I could read the second line by calling textfile.readLine again. And because the first line has already been sort of read and processed, this will immediately go on to the next line of the text and it'll read me that next line as well. So now if I print out the second line, I can get printed out again, it's a very fine morning. So I can be able to read each line one at a time. If we want to, we could use a loop to say do this over and over and over again and just keep calling readLine to read one line at a time, getting each one into a different string. But what tends to be, that works okay, but what tends to be, but files, because we can do that, files are actually iterable types, so we're able to effectively do that looping directly. So rather than trying to say that I want to read files one line at a time, I can do the same thing by looping over the contents of the file in order to basically read each line of the file one after another all the way down. So let me demonstrate how that works. So I'm going to just do that in another block. I'm going to once again open up my file. And then in this case, instead of calling readLine to read one individual line of the file, I'm actually going to use a for loop to loop over the lines of this file. So what I'll say is I'm going to say that for each line in the text file, so standard for loop, then I can say print out that line of text. So again, what this is going to do is it's going to loop through, it's going to go through every line in the file, printing out each one of them as we go. So when I execute this code, I then get my 3 lines, hello world, with an extra line break, so that there's the line break from the text itself plus the line break at the end of printing, so that's why I get this extra double spacing there. It's a very fine morning, and Python. If I take that line, I call the strip function on it, that will remove that extra new line character, and then I can get them to sort of be all more compact and where we need to go. So this works fine if I want to, say, loop through all the lines, because I just want to print out everything, or I want to maybe search through my file to be able to find a particular line of text that's interest. I really like using for loops to loop through files. I think that's part of why I introduced it at this point in the course. That said, it's not necessarily the most useful way of dealing with data, because now I can treat each line individually inside the loop, but that doesn't tell me where it is in the file or like what other lines are. It becomes hard to sort of process the whole thing all at once. So often if you really want to read individual files and save them all as variables, you can use textfile.readLine, but you can use a loop if you just need to like go through the whole file to like say look for the word Python or look for the word hello. But that said, it's a little bit easier to do this .readLine thing over and over and over and over again. And because you're often going to say I want to read all the lines of the file, but I really like to say take all those lines and I'd like to basically use them to create some kind of list so that I maybe have all the lines of the file inside of a single value for me to do that kind of work. We could build that up directly, right? I could say make myself a lines list. That can be a new list, and then I could just say take my lines list and I can append each line to that lines list. I don't need to print it out at the end. And then if I wanted to, I could then, after I'm all done with that, I can then say I want to print out my lines list. And this will then do the same thing where I can then create a list of all the lines of the file. You'll you'll notice that the final Python doesn't have a line break because I didn't actually hit enter at the end of line 3, so it doesn't have a line break because it doesn't go on to line 4. So that works fine, again, if you're trying to produce a list. But that said, if you want to create a list of all the lines, you don't actually need to write your own for loop. You can actually use a third way of processing this file, which will let you basically get that line, that list of lines automatically. So the way that we're going to do that is, once again, we're going to open up the file. So we're going to say with opening the file as text file. I can then take my text file and I can call the read lines plural. Notice the S here. We're reading lines, multiple lines. And what that will do is, instead of returning one string representing one line, that will return an list of all the lines in the file. So I might call this lines, because this is all the lines in the file. Just like, here, I'll call it lines list, because it's basically doing the same things we did above. If I print out then lines list, then you can see that I get the same result that I had with the for loop, but I've done the whole thing by just reading through the entire text file as one into one giant list. Read lines works great for most of the data processing we want to do with text files. The one thing you want to be careful about when using the read lines method is that the file that you're trying to read isn't too big, because this is going to read the entire content of that file into your computer's memory and open it up in memory for your computer to be able to process. If the file you're trying to open is really, really big, if it's like, say, the entire text of War and Peace or of the Oxford English Dictionary or some other giant massive tome, then that's going to load a lot of stuff into memory, and it might start slowing down your computer the same way that opening up a really huge video or a really giant image file on your computer might slow things down. You probably don't need to worry about this with most sort of consumer grade hardware these days, but it's worth keeping sort of thinking about the fact that the reason we don't always read lines and just grab the whole thing as a list is because we may not want to get all that content. I may only want to deal with a single line, or maybe only deal with one line at a time to be able to get through these pieces. All right, so those are the three ways that we're going to end up reading contents from a file. We can call read line to read one line at a time. I can use a for loop, and I'm going to sort of go back to the version of this that's clean. But I can use a for loop to say process and work through each line of the file one at a time. Or I can use the read lines method in order to say read all the contents of a file into a single list. All right, and that's how we read files. So the exact same process is going to apply if we deal with things that are not just text files, if they happen to be things like CSV files. So a CSV file is a comma separated values list. It's basically a text file, but it has it's a table of data where each thing is separated by a comma. This is the same CSV file that I have you work with for the exercises, so you at least can see how this works. What we can then do for that is we would be able to read and process that file in the exact same way we did with a text file. So again, I'm going to open up the file, but instead of opening myfile.txt, I can open up letters.csv, because that's the name of the file. And then we can decide how we want to process this. So for example, I might say that I want to read this as a list of rows, right? Because if we look at our content, we have a list of rows. I got 1, 2, 3, 4, and a blank row. So we might say, let's read that as a list of rows by using this read lines function, and then I can get myself a list where each list is going to be where there's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4 elements inside of it. Okay, so the way we might do that is we might say, okay, let's take my rows list, because I make a list of rows, by calling my this isn't a CSV. Let's call this a CSV file. Keep things really clean. So my CSV file dot read lines, right? We're going to read all the lines particular in one group. And then we can print out what we're getting, just for fun. And then we get our array, right? So then I got my list. So I have my list that has the first line with a new line character, the second line with a new line character, the third line with a new line character, and the fourth line with a new line character as well. So there's all of our content, right? I've now read the CSV file into a list of rows. But now that I have a list of rows, I might want to do some further processing upon that. So I might say, okay, great. Well, I have this list of rows. That's a list, so it means I can loop through it using a for loop. So I might say that for each row in the rows list, I might do something like, say, maybe I want to print out each row individually on its own line, just for giggles, I guess. And that can do that work. We notice that we now have all these extra white spaces, so I might say, let's go ahead and strip off that extra new line space in order to print them all out. So now I'm printing it out like a table because I'm printing out as 4 strings. But when we're trying to deal with tables, we're generally trying to get them into a format that's going to look like a nested list, right? A list of lists. So the idea here is that rather than having this row be a single string, what I'd really like is to have each of those elements in that row list be a list themselves. So instead of having instead of printing here, I'm gonna do down here for a second. So I'm gonna print out what rows list looks like. But so instead of having a list of 4 strings, right, 1 string, 2 strings, 3 strings, 4 strings, I'd like to have a list of 4 other lists. So the way that we could potentially do that is I might say, well, let's loop through all of these rows, but I want to keep track on which index they are, right? Is it the first row, the second row, the third row, or the fourth row? So the way you remember to do that is I would say for index in range of my length in a range that goes from 0 to the length of my rows list. This is our standard looping through a set of indices. Then I could, for example, print out each row at its particular index, stripping off that last piece. Whoop, that didn't quite work. Sorry. Rows list at that index. So then I can print out, again, I'm printing out sort of the same thing. But once I've then done that, is I might say, like, okay, if I print out this individual row index, right, this one thing, because that is a string, but it has all these commas separated in it, I can actually take that string and automatically break it apart into a list that I can then do some work with. So for example, I could say, let's take my rows list. Then I'm going to strip. So this is going to be, this will be the row itself is going to be that thing. And then I might say, let's take the row and I can use a split function on it and split it up by commas, which will basically say, let's break it up into a list where we're going to sort of split it apart into each element based on finding all those commas as delimiters. So going to be this might be the row as a list, becomes this kind of thing, and then I can print out the row as a list. And you can see that now I'm able to loop through and produce, and then for each row in each row in my file, I can then process them into a list themselves. Once you have that, there's a couple of ways we can then get it back into the place we want it to be. For example, I might say that, well, I know that the row originally occurred at rows list index. So if I say, let's take rows, oops, sorry, I need to copy paste this. If I say, let's take rows list index, I can then replace that string, right? I can overwrite this string by assigning a different variable in place of that string. And the variable I'd like to replace that string with is the row as list. So what we're going to do is we're going to replace the string with a list. Right, so then again, we're going to grab it out of one spot and put it back somewhere else. The same thing that we've done when processing through these two-dimensional lists. So once we do that, we can then sort of generate that. We run through that content. We generate it looks like. If we then print out what our rows list looks like now, and I'll just do it in the next cell so you can compare them, you can see that we now have a list, right? There's my big list, and it has contents for one row. It has lists where each list is going to be a set of values that were inside that table. So effectively, I've developed now a list of lists. I've produced myself a data table that I can do some work with in order to process this kind of piece. So the main things to keep in mind for dealing with files is that we have our boilerplate sort of line of code here that's going to let us open up files. We say with open path to file as a name for the file. We can then read its contents by using .readline or using .readlines. If we're working with something like a CSV, we can take those lines that we've read as a list, and we can loop through that list and then do the same kind of processing we do whether or not it had come from a file. It doesn't matter at this point that we got that data from a file. It's just a list, and we can run through and process it and do whatever we need to do with it, including breaking it apart into, say, a row of, into, say, like a table full of data. And that's the basic idea of how we're going to be able to read and work with files, and that should be able to get you what you need to do for the assignment for this week.